Moving on to Syria, where 2 suicide bomb attacks and a Syrian army checkpoint have left at least 24 people dead, more than 100 injured in the city of Homs. Already targeted by bombings numerous times before, local authorities said that during the chaos of the car bomb blast's aftermath, as a crowd gathered, the second suicide bomber detonated his explosive belt. Now, Islamic State militants have claimed responsibility for the attack on Homs, once dubbed the capital of Syria's uprising, currently and nowadays a very sad place. And with local reconciliation talks underway in Vienna, ISIS are now doubling their efforts and zealously targeting pro-government forces. After years of devastating fighting and government sieges, most of the city is now back under Assad's regime hands, at least partially thanks to heavy Russian army involvement in the area. Caught between ISIS and Assad, Syrian opposition is entering the talks on the low. Now, Ali Waked is still with me in studio, and I think one of the main things, if we're looking not just at the Iranian deal, is also the Russian involvement in the Iranian deal, but specifically also in Syria ahead of these talks. And when it comes to, before we start this, when it comes to the Russian involvement, let's take a look at the following report from ABC News about the Russians' involvement in Syria as all this hell is going on in that country, and what that means pre the talks.
Inside a Russian armored personnel carrier, we head towards the front lines, to the village of Salma, which now lies shattered after a ferocious battle 2 weeks ago. For 3 years, rebels against the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad controlled this strategic village until Russian air power arrived.
So you came in on the ground and the Russians were in the sky? Yes. Yes. And now, this is Syria. Yes. Yeah. Salma is yours.
In the 3 months since Russia joined the fighting here, their forces have turned the tide of battle. Massive airstrikes and cruise missile attacks have pulverized the rebels and bolstered the Assad regime. We went to the main Russian airbase in Syria, the jets roaring day and night here.
This is the tip of the spear of Russian air power in Syria.
But the U.S., Britain, and others say Russia is helping the Assad regime a lot more than they're fighting ISIS, and they accuse their forces of indiscriminate attacks that have killed hundreds of civilians. Russian General Igor Konashenkov dismissed the charge. What civilian facilities are you talking about, he says. These are powerful groups of terrorists. One thing is clear, the Russians are here for the long haul, and some Syrians are welcoming them.
Well, clearly heavy Russian involvement in Syria. Speaking of Moscow, we had, reports from Al Arabiya English say that Moscow denies asking Assad to step down, which I think is something that everybody was hoping pre these talks that are supposed to start,
It's not only the report of Al Arabiya, Yael, it's the press conference that was led yesterday by Minister Lavrov, who denied these reports. And I think, Yael, we are going to see maybe, and I'm saying maybe Friday, negotiation talks in Syria, because on the ground the regime has no interest to he's not in a rush to see these negotiations happening. In the last week only, he succeeded to liberate 2 strategic cities, one near the borders with Turkey and one near the border with Jordan. This is why Lavrov yesterday also put the question of the Kurds' participation as an obstacle in front of these talks, because there are huge pressure over the opposition to boycott these because of the Russian involvement on the ground and in the negotiations.
And of course, as we know, these opposition forces that probably have said over the course of the last 4 years will not sit down if Assad is still an option to stay in power. We're going to keep an eye on that one. Ali, I want to thank you as we move along. Moving along to press with Ami Kaufman. Yes.
Yes, as we know, one of the direct results of what's going on in Syria is, of course, the huge, massive refugee influx to Europe. Now, European leaders were meeting in Amsterdam the past few days to talk about the Schengen area, which has been so far a passport-free area, but that might change. We have a report about it. Let's check it out.
Let's take a look.
Europe's refugees are destabilizing the Schengen agreement. The Schengen zone comprises 26 states, most of which are also EU members, and allows for crossing borders within those states with no border control. European Union interior ministers have placed pressure on Greece over migration, with some threatening to oust it from the continent's landmark free travel zone.
I believe it is clear that if it is not manageable to protect the external EU border, meaning Greek-Turkish border, then the Schengen external border will move towards Central Europe. If it is demanded that Greece has to strengthen its resources as soon as possible and accept the help.
The Danish government is trying to deal with the migrants with a new controversial bill that concerns the UN and attracts criticism from human rights organizations. The so-called jewelry bill that passed today is meant to deter refugees from seeking asylum and includes a clause allowing valuables to be confiscated to pay for their stay.
The decision to give Danish police the authority to search and confiscate valuables from asylum seekers sends damaging messages in our view. It runs the risk of fueling sentiments of fear and discrimination rather than promoting solidarity with people in need of protection.
All over the continent, tension between Europeans and migrants is intensifying over violent incidents and new bills and restrictions. In Mölndal, Sweden, an asylum center employee was allegedly stabbed to death by a 15-year-old asylum seeker, local media reported. The employee was taken to hospital but died of her wounds. More than 1 million people arrived in Europe last year, and the numbers show little sign of falling, presenting a major challenge for EU countries. It's a challenge that is shaking the foundations of the 28-nation bloc.
Yes,
and let's go to Israel.
Please.
Where Culture Minister Miri Regev is making waves again.
I want to say
she is going to
clash, the culture clash.
The culture clash.
Yes, okay.
Introducing a bill called Loyalty in Culture. This is a new
and this is
amendment.
from Ynet. This is the one of the.
Well, this headline is from Ynet, but it's splashed all over Israeli media, of course. And this is an amendment that seeks to change the way her office supports cultural institutions and to deny state funding to those who attack or disgrace the state flag or state symbols, incite to racism, violence, or terrorism, mark Independence Day as a day of mourning, which many Palestinians, some, not many, Palestinians do because they consider it the Nakba, or deny Israel's existence as a Jewish and democratic state. Now, of course, there's still a bill in a very...
Art and speech.
That's what a lot of people are saying as well.
Freedom of art and speech.
And I would agree with that, by the way.
Yeah, this will unfold throughout the day. We're going to try and touch on it more tomorrow.
Right, it's important to notice that it's coming on the wave of, there's a lot of talk about this new textbook, a civics textbook, that is being put out by the Education Ministry, which has many false claims, apparently, allegedly, because we haven't seen it yet. But this is being reported in Haaretz and other media, claiming that most of the attacks in this current wave of violence are committed by Arab citizens of Israel, which is totally false. And now claims, the Ministry of Education claims that the editor of this book is part of breaking the silence.
Right.
So this is just...
No, it's not just a culture clash. I think it's a clash when we're speaking about democracy. It's democracy fighting to survive in some ways. Yes.
Speaking of that wave of violence, a very interesting op-ed from the editor of Times of Israel, David Horowitz, who is really blaming a lot of the situation on Palestinian incitement. And I just want to show you one quote. Previous peace efforts created a joint mechanism intended to combat incitement on both sides. And Abbas has pronounced himself ready to revive that mechanism. Israel should take him up on that right away. Now, you know, if we had time, Yael, I would tell you how much I dislike this op-ed and disagree with it, but we don't. But this is basically finger-pointing the whole situation of what's going on now at Palestinian incitement.
And within a newspaper heavily read by a Jewish Israeli population, and it's just fueling the flames. One would say.
One would say, but this is pretty much the tone of what's of the Israeli government, and I think a majority of Israelis. So
there we have it.
Interesting interview that Stephen Colbert had on 2 nights ago, I think, with Donald Rumsfeld, the man who a lot of people think is responsible for
I think one of the trios, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and George Bush, War of Iraq 2003.
War of Iraq 2003, the invasion. Now, it's a fascinating interview. I highly recommend watching the whole thing. I want to show you a specific snippet where Colbert kind of tangles him and asks him, it makes him squirm, and asks him about that imprecise, what he calls, intelligence that made Americans invade Iraq. And what's your Rumsfeld answer?
I've been waiting for that moment for over a decade. Let's take a look.
And I was saying, I'm not trying to ask you an unfair question. I'm trying to ask you what I think is a fair question. But were there things that the administration or you knew that we didn't learn about out of the best possible intentions, which is there were things that would undermine the case for a war you thought was necessary to save the United States?
the president had available to him intelligence from all elements of the government. And the National Security Council members had that information. It was all shared, it was all supplied, and it's never certain. If it were a fact, it wouldn't be called intelligence.
Wow. I think you answered my question.
As we said, I've been waiting for that. If it were a fact, it wouldn't be called intelligence. That is frightening sometimes to think who really runs our lives and who controls the world. Yeah,
It's amazing, amazing. One of those, Rumsfeld has a lot of funny ways of putting his words are just crazy. And this is going to go down in history as one of the
Oscar music in our ears. Stay with us. When we get back, more news.